Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight's Silmarillion airs our long journey through the elder days of Tolkien's Legendarium comes to an end with the very brief encapsulation of The Lord of the Rings. We have got 3,000 years of history to cover tonight, and this is the professor's work, so we're not going to cover it in a straight line. We're going to jump around quite a lot. So let us waste no further ado and get right into it. Good evening, Galadriel. Thank you for joining me here live in the chat. I'm going to apologize right up front, by the way, just in case we have any ongoing technical issues tonight. I had a bit of a technical hiccup when I was broadcasting my Shire Reckoning episode on Tuesday, and as I sat down this evening, I realized that I'm getting terrible lag in my system, and I don't really understand what is going on. It's just a thing that happens here as I'm, prepping. There's always one last thing that you need to check. So in the name of a much more dependable and reliable podcasting studio, let me recommend patreon.com/nextword, where you can pledge your support and help me buy new equipment when this equipment imminently, invariably craps out on me. Let's get into our discussion. Last time we dealt with the final apocalyptic fall of Numenor, and then we skipped back in time. As I say, Tolkien likes to do that a lot. We skipped back in time to the beginning of the Second Age to lay out the story of Middle-earth proper, with a particular focus on Sauron and on the elves of Eregion, of Hollin, of that region to the west there of Khazad-dûm. And of course, we talked at length about the forging of the Rings of Power and the death of the last remaining descendant of Feanor, Celebrimbor. And we made it all the way to basically the end of the Second Age, right? A century before the end of the Second Age, when the last of the Numenorean faithful flee the sinking Numenor and come to the shores of Middle-earth. They create the northern kingdom of Arnor, ruled by Elendil, the southern kingdom of Gondor, ruled by Isildur and his brother Anarion equally. And that is where we pick up with this week's session, if I can here share a slide with you. Many treasures and great heirlooms of virtue and wonder the exiles had brought from Numenor, and of these the most renowned were the Seven Stones and the White Tree. The White Tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the Fair that stood in the courts of the king at Armenelos in Numenor, ere Sauron burned it. And Nimloth was in its turn descended from the tree of Tirion, that was an image of the eldest of trees, White Telperion, which Yavanna caused to grow in the land of the Valar. The tree, memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valinor, was planted in Minas Ithil before the house of Isildur, since he it was that saved the fruit from destruction. But the stones were divided. 3 Elendil took, and his sons each 2. Those of Elendil were set in towers upon Emin Beriad and upon Amon Sul and the city of Anuminas. But those of his sons were at Minas Ithil and Minas Anor and at Orthanc and in Osgiliath. Now these stones had this virtue, that those who looked therein might perceive in them things far off, whether in place or in time. For the most part, they revealed only things near to another kindred stone, for the stones each called to each. But those who possessed great strength of will and of mind might learn to direct their gaze whither they would. Thus the Númenóreans were aware of many things that their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. So let's consider first the tree. We kind of sketched this back when we saw it happen, right there on the page in the Akallabeth. But you'll remember the white tree of Armenelos, Nimloth the Fair, from which Isildur stole the fruit, which he here plants in Minas Ithil, his own personal tower, right there on the eastern side of Osgiliath. This is not the tree that we will be familiar with in The Lord of the Rings. We can tell immediately because this tree is planted in Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, and that tower will become Minas Morgul. Sauron will attack Minas Ithil about 80 years from now, right? About 80 years after this tree is first planted, and Isildur will take a sapling of that tree, which he will plant at Minas Arnor after the Battle of Dagorlad and the defeat of Sauron. That tree also is not the tree that we know from The Lord of the Rings, because that tree is killed in 1636 of the Third Age by the Great Plague that ravages much of Middle-earth. A third tree, which is the one that we see in The Lord of the Rings, is planted in 1640 by King Tarandor and lasts until the death of Belicthor II, the ruling steward of Gondor, in 2872, at which point the dead tree is left standing. Aragorn, after he becomes king, spoilers, will find another sapling on the mountain above Minas Tirith, which seems to him to be the sign that he won't just be king, but he will found a good and noble dynasty with Arwen. So those are the trees, and it is complicated. It's also really fascinating to note how much time Isildur spends taking fruit from trees, taking saplings from trees, planting new trees. It's a very important thing. We don't usually count him among the among the gardeners of Middle-earth, that's a title that we usually preserve for Sam. Faramir gets it. That's all very appropriate and very worthwhile. But yeah, Isildur out here just gardening it up. The Palantiri, meanwhile, are much more complicated. They are usually thought, if you've stuck around here, they're usually thought to have been created by Feanor back in the years of the trees. There's a passage that we discussed back when we looked at that chapter, and I expressed then and will express again a certain doubt. It's not that I don't think that they were potentially created by Feanor. It's that the text itself is not conclusive. The conclusive attribution to Feanor comes in the index of names at the end of the Silmarillion, which is composed by Christopher Tolkien during the editorial process to put this published volume together. The only other reference we get besides that ambiguous reference of Feanor, the semi-eponymous chapter, is in the Two Towers, right? We get this exchange in the Two Towers when the Orthanc stone is recovered, and Pippin and Gandalf are talking about it, and we get this, quote, "Then it was not made," Pippin hesitated, "by the enemy?" "No," said Gandalf, "nor by Saruman. It is beyond his art and beyond Sauron's too. The Palantiri came from beyond Westerness, from Eldamar. The Noldor made them. Feanor himself maybe wrought them in days so long ago that time cannot be measured in years. But there is nothing that Sauron cannot turn to evil uses." That's it. Feanor himself maybe wrought them, says Gandalf. That's the limit of his knowledge. It's possible, and it is possible, but it's, to my mind at least, inconclusive. Galadriel Becky's pointing out here in the chat, I never thought of this before, but Galadriel's pool of water acts like the stones when Frodo looks in it. That's very interesting. Yes, I mean, I'm marshalling my thoughts here, trying to figure out the best way to approach each of these in sequential order. You're right, Galadriel Becky, right? It is a very similar phenomenon, and it highlights the quality of the Palantiri that we're told about on this slide, which we never really investigate, which is that the stones don't just allow you to look through space, to look across space, but to look through time. These stones had the virtue of that those who look therein might perceive in them things far off, whether in place or in time. We don't see, really, the Palantiri being used to prophetic effect, either in the pages of the Silmarillion or indeed in the pages of the Lord of the Rings. Instead, we use the Mirror of Galadriel to kind of get that same effect, right? But I wonder if there's a similar technology there. And of course, if the Palantiri are created by Feanor, who is closer to Feanor at that time? Not emotionally close to Feanor. We'll remember how little Galadriel thinks of her cousin there, but physically proximate, right? They are together at that time, and it's possible that she picked up a trick or two, or that, someone else in her retinue picked up a trick or two. But I think you're absolutely right to note the similarity there. It is fascinating to think about the Palantiri because they are so provocative, right? There is something about the Palantiri. Perhaps it is just the visual iconography as it's presented to us in the film, although I think that the fascination with the Palantiri predates the Jackson trilogy for sure. There is something about them. Perhaps it's because we simply don't get many artifacts of power in the pages of the Lord of the Rings, right? There aren't that many things that are just magical in a cool way, right? Obviously, the ring is magical. Obviously, all the rings of power are magical, but with the exception of the invisibility effect, what power do they have? What level 5 spells do they allow you to cast? But the Palantiri are both effectively magical and convey their power in a very direct and authoritative way within the pages of the Lord of the Rings. So I think it's not surprising, perhaps, that well, I'm depressing myself now, right? Because, of course, many Tolkien fans are fascinated by the Palantiri, and that would include people who perhaps ought not to be Tolkien fans. I'm thinking in particular of real-life supervillain Peter Thiel, who named his data mining operation Palantir back in 2002, 2003. It's been in the news recently, but back in 2002 or 2003, whenever it was that he started that whole misguided endeavor, he chose the name Palantir. And I am the last person on Earth to wish that the Tolkien estate had more power. But in this one instance, I wish that the Tolkien estate had more power. I wish that the Tolkien estate could at least remove from the ownership of people who, if they have read the books, clearly have not understood the books, the names of Professor Tolkien's greatest artifacts. It's all over the place. He also owns a company named Mithril. Like, just a bad dude, right? Idiot billionaires, misunderstanding books. It's a long tradition. Let's take a look at, I want to call up that same slide, in fact, and let you see here the division of these stones, because I do think that this is very interesting. The Palantiri are still connected in part. These are not all of the Palantiri. These are not the only ones still in existence. We know for sure that there is at least one more. We know for sure that there is a Master Stone on Tol Eressëa in Avalone, right? That can still, when these stones are brought to Numenor by the elves of Tol Eressëa, they are gifted to the faithful so that even in the effect of the Ban of the Valar, they can still reach out. They can still use the Palantiri to see Tol Eressëa and to experience some of the blessing of the Blessed Realm, right? There's still a way of maintaining a contact there for the faithful of Numenor. This is after that swing against the Valar has begun there. So these 7 Palantiri are taken from Numenor by Elendil, as we see here, distributed north and south, right? Elendil gets 3, each of his sons get 2 each. They are pretty broadly geographically separated, which is, of course, what you would expect, right? In the north at Elistirion, the White Towers, west of the Shire, the White Towers, the eponymous White Towers there, are constructed by Elendil, and that Palantir is housed in the tallest of those towers. There's another in Annúminas, in the capital of Arnor, just north of the Shire by Lake Evendim. If you go and look at your lordoftheringsproject.com, you can see exactly where that is. And then the other, of course, goes to Amon Sul. It goes to Weathertop. It remains there for a good... We'll talk exactly about what happens in just a moment. In Gondor, they go to Minas Ithil and Minas Anor, right? Split between Isildur and Anarion. Osgiliath itself, which presumably is Isildur's second stone, and Orthanc, all the way out there on the west. The Elistirion stone, the one that remains at the White Towers, Elendil's stone, as it is also known, is protected by the elves after Elendil's death. Many elves actually... I was hesitating. I wanted to just double check internally to see if the word pilgrimage was appropriate, and I think that it is. Many elves make pilgrimages. That is apparently what Glorfindel is doing. Not Glorfindel. Who is it that I'm thinking of? I will come back to that. All these G names are getting tangled up in my brain tonight. So that one stays there, and it is actually still there during the period of the Lord of the Rings. That stone gets taken on the same white ship as Frodo and Bilbo and Gandalf. The stones of Annúminas and Amon Sul, meanwhile, are lost at sea after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. They are... We try to keep them safe. We try to get them out of the Northern Kingdoms after the centuries-long war with Angmar, and they are lost at sea. The Osgiliath stone is similarly lost in the waters of the Anduin after the civil war called the Kinstrife in the Third Age. The Ithil stone was captured by the Nazgul and taken to Barad-dûr, where it was presumably, or the temporality is complicated here, where it presumably will be destroyed in the fall of Barad-dûr. The Anor stone is the one hanging out in Minas Tirith that corrupts Denethor, in effect, or which Denethor uses and thereby falls to the corruption of Sauron. And the Orthanc stone is, of course, the Orthanc stone. That's the big one. That's the Saruman one. There's an interesting point of speculation. And this is another way in which the Palantiri are just interesting. They're just kind of evocative in a really interesting way. It is speculated that one of the reasons that Saruman has much more trouble, apparently, using his Palantir in Orthanc than either Denethor or Aragorn do when they are using either the Anor stone or the Orthanc stone, respectively, right? You'll remember Aragorn, of course, deliberately using the Palantir to provoke Sauron, to get a rise out of Sauron, and to lead his attention away from the hobbits crossing Mordor, and instead look north to the Morannon and the army of the West that will meet them there. The reason that Denethor and Aragorn are more effective in their use of the Palantiri is apparently that they are the natural, rightful owners of those things. And I don't know how that works. I don't know what the magic is there, but I think that's fantastic. That, though, is that an argument that these are not, in fact, the creation of Fëanor? I have so much ground to cover tonight, and now I'm getting sidetracked into the most obscure tangents here. I will put a pin in that. If you guys are interested in a conversation on that, maybe head on over to Shire Reckoning. Maybe I'll bring this up in a couple weeks. We'll take a look at the actual nature of the Palantiri and where they come from. Let's get onwards, though, to the return of Sauron here. If If I can click through to my next slide, there we are. Thus the exiles of Numenor established their realms in Arnor and in Gondor, and ere many years had passed, it became manifest that their enemy, Sauron, had also returned. He came in secret, as has been told, to his ancient kingdom of Mordor beyond the Efelduath, the Mountains of Shadow, and that country marched with Gondor upon the east. There about the valley of Gorgoroth was built his fortress vast and strong, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, and there was a fiery mountain in that land that the elves named Orodruin. Indeed, for that reason Sauron set there his dwelling long before, for he used the fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and in his forging, and in the midst of the land of Mordor he had fashioned the ruling ring. There now he brooded in the dark until he had wrought for himself a new shape, and it was terrible, for his fair semblance had departed forever when he was cast into the abyss at the drowning of Numenor. He took up again the great ring and clothed himself in power, and the malice of the eye of Sauron few even of the great among elves and men could endure. I mentioned in last week's show that this is the reward, in effect, right, for reading the Silmarillion. And if it was true last week, it is doubly true. This week we are getting familiar names. We are positioning them geographically, temporally, politically with more transparency than we do in The Lord of the Rings, right? We're getting this higher order kind of rhetorical tier. We're getting this higher order narrative perspective that allows us to really piece together the history in a much more effective and transparent way, as of course this text should, because it is presented to us as a history of these days. So we have the northern kingdom of Arnor, the southern kingdom of Gondor, and now the dark kingdom of Mordor, once again reestablished in the shadow. Why is Sauron in Mordor? Well, it turns out that he's in Mordor for Mount Doom. That is a large part of his calculation here. That is where he fashions the ruling ring with the ancient heat of the earth, right? With the ancient fires, of course, associated with Melkor, with Morgoth. So we can anchor ourselves a little bit in the timeline here too. He fashions, as we discussed last week, he fashions the One Ring prior to his departure for Numenor. His departure for Numenor makes it sound like he's got a cruise ship all lined up and waiting. Before his capture by Ar-Pharazôn, right? He leaves that ring, he leaves the One Ring behind in Barad-dûr, which suggests to me very powerfully that Barad-dûr is not abandoned, that Mordor is not abandoned, that he has not, in his capture by Ar-Pharazôn, done anything to collapse his own military infrastructure, in effect, right? That Mordor is still dangerous throughout that entire period, which really, I suppose, doesn't last that long, right? I'm not sure why he doesn't take the ring. I'm not sure of the argument. I mean, I'm aware of the Doyleist explanation here, right? That, of course, he leaves the One Ring behind in Barad-dûr because if the One Ring is swept into the ocean after the collapse of Numenor, then it's going to be much, much harder for Deagol to find it later. Like that is a much more committed fishing trip to make that happen. So that is the superficial textual explanation, but I'm not sure what the in-universe explanation is for Sauron leaving such an important and valuable artifact behind. So he returns from Numenor again. I'm using the most soft language here. He is cast out of his physical form and flees back to Mordor as a dark spirit, where it takes him a good long time, takes him decades to rebuild his own physical form, to take the black armored form, presumably, that we are so familiar with. Note here, too, the similarity between Sauron and Morgoth, both of whom have lost the innate ability, the ability that is innate to all of the Ainur, to change their forms. That seems to be the case with Sauron here. At least he has lost his fair-seeming form, right? He cannot now become Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He cannot now become the Sauron who goes to Numenor. He has to be this truer representation of his fundamental nature. Morgoth, of course, also lost his power, his ability to transform himself through the investment, the externalization of his own power in his legion of fell creations, right? Specifically in Ungoliant, prior to the darkening of Valinor and the taking down of the trees, in the dragons, in the orcs, in the Balrogs, in the matter, the stuff of Arda itself. Melkor's power is so distributed that he no longer has enough power to change his own form. And I have to wonder whether that is a similar effect, whether we're seeing something similar happening here, particularly picking up from last week's discussion on whether or not facade of Valerian provocation, right? The changing weather and the giant eagle clouds out of the west and the lightning bolt assassination of random Numenorian dudes, right? I'm not sure if we are supposed to read in part Sauron's new inability to change his shape effectively or freely to change his shape as a consequence of the expenditure of power back in Numenor. I think those are just two interesting data points, which you can certainly line up if you want them to be closer together, for sure. So, he is back. The malice of the eye of Sauron, few even of the great among elves and men could endure. Something has to be done. We've got to take this guy down. When therefore Sauron saw his time, he came with great force against the new realm of Gondor, and he took Minas Ithil, and he destroyed the white tree of Isildur that grew there. But Isildur escaped, and taking with him a seedling of the tree, he went with his wife and his sons by ship down the river, and they sailed from the mouths of Anduin seeking Elendil. Meanwhile, Anarion held Osgiliath against the enemy, and for that time drove him back to the mountains. But Sauron gathered his strength again, and Anarion knew that unless help should come, his kingdom would not long stand. Now Elendil and Gil-galad took counsel together, for they perceived that Sauron would grow too strong and would overcome all his enemies one by one if they did not unite against him. Therefore they made that league which is called the Last Alliance. And they marched east into Middle-earth, gathering a great host of elves and men, and they halted for a while at Imladris. It is said that the host that was there assembled was fairer and more splendid in arms than any that has been seen in Middle-earth, and none greater has been mustered since the host of the Valar went against Thangorodrim. Note the implied asterisk at the end of this slide. This is the best and biggest and fairest army seen in Middle-earth since the War of Wrath, right? That's the host of the Valar going up against Thangorodrim. That is the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age. That is the ruin of Beleriand. Which leads me to ask, how does the army of the Last Alliance, the host of the Last Alliance, match up against the army of Ar-Pharazôn, which sat down on a hilltop at the down there in Umbar and demanded the surrender of Sauron like 150, I guess a little more than that, 170 years ago? Because we can excuse the golden armament as being like a naval force, not technically being in Middle-earth. But I think that the inescapable conclusion from this paragraph, this is one of those Tolkienian superlatives, I think, and it slipped my notice every time that I have read this part of the book until today. The inescapable conclusion, if we can't find a loophole, is that the host of the Last Alliance is actually greater than the army landed by Ar-Pharazôn at the havens of Umbar, which is a phenomenal thing to think about, a phenomenal thing to try and wrap your head around, right? We're going to be told that one of the reasons that this host is so powerful is that the elves are still strong in these days, in the Elder Days, right? The men have not yet lost, the blood of Numenor has not yet become diluted by generation after generation after generation, and I'll asterisk that with, yes, Tolkien, 19th century race theory, not great, but a very pure part of the story, right? This then has to be just an order of magnitude higher. And I always thought that, again, to go back to the movies, right? I always thought that Jackson kind of laid it on a little thick, particularly with what we see of the Battle of Dagorlad, the host of the Last Alliance. But maybe he didn't. Maybe, in fact, he didn't lay it on thick enough. Maybe there is even more spectacle involved here. In any case, yeah, the host of the Last Alliance is a formidable force by any measure. It is led by Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, with support from Elrond, who is his second in command. Círdan is there. Thranduil is there with his dad, Oropher. More on them later this evening. And of course, Elendil and Isildur, and ultimately Anarion will join them too. And if you're wondering how many of those named heroes survived this battle, it is half. It is exactly half. The short rest here that we get at Rivendell, they halted for a while at Imladris. Yes, that is 3 years. That is not a chance to use the bathroom and get a soda from the gas station. That is a long time that they stay encamped at Rivendell, or all across that part of Middle Earth, I guess, because it's such a huge army that they're marshalling. But during that time, they are forging new weapons, new armor, preparing for the all-out attack, which is, I think, the meaning of the name Last Alliance. This, I don't believe, is glossed anywhere. I don't believe that Tolkien ever addresses this directly, but it is such an evocative name, right? And we think of it as being so compatible with the idea of the waning of Middle-earth, that Middle-earth is going to always be less in the future than it was in the past. The greatest days are always behind us. And this last alliance is going to be the last great expression of military strength in the world. It's going to be the last moment of real profound unification by peoples who are still, if not at their height, then at least close to their height. And the Númenóreans, we have to remember, are really close to their height, because although they have dwindled while in Númenor, they are still enjoying the benefits of the gifts of the Valar in the first place, following the War of Wrath. So these are the best and brightest. But it's not the last alliance in the sense that this is the last time that anyone is going to work together, as is demonstrated by the Lord of the Rings, right? As is demonstrated by everything that flows forth from that story. There is a sense in which it might mean the last alliance, in the sense that if we do not ally ourselves now, there will be nothing left to save. Sauron will conquer everybody one by one. That's what we're told. But there's also this idea of it being the last alliance of the Golden Age, it being the last alliance of these people at their greatest height. And no matter what, as I just said, half of the named heroes in this army are going to fall during this battle. There will be a spending of power during this battle, during this war, that will never be restored. That power just isn't coming back. And it's interesting to think, when we're dealing with the work of Professor Tolkien, particularly here as we're coming close to the end of this story, right? Presumably I'll be able to power my way through the, 10 more slides that I have tonight to get all the way there. But there is something very profound about the question of finitude. There is something very profound about the question of how a resource is enjoyed and used and spent. And I'd never really considered it as a major theme of the Silmarillion, but it is a major theme of the Silmarillion, going all the way back to the Flame Imperishable, going all the way back, right? That is the exception, the Flame Imperishable. That is the one thing that is not going to burn out. But from that point to this, every expression of power, particularly what we might think of as magic power, as divine power, as supernatural power, right? Magic in the world of Middle-earth. Every time power is spent, it is then gone, or it is lost, it is externalized, it is put into something beyond our own measure. Right? That is the story of the ring, but we see it so many times through the arc of this story. And thinking about that moment of the end of this age, the coming of the last alliance, right? The ruination of Númenor, the separating of Valinor from the world, now that the world has been bent and reformed and is now a proper globe, right? All of these things, we're seeing not just the waning of those people who remain, but the stripping away of so many of these other elements of narrative, of myth, right? Myth is a better way of putting that. All of these things are now passing into the West. And there's always this sense, from this point onward, all the way through. Not so much The Hobbit, honestly. We don't really wrestle with that. A little bit. We do wrestle with it a little bit, but not as much as perhaps we should. But from this point to the end of The Lord of the Rings, we're going to be aware of, it's 3,500 years of history, but there's still going to be that feeling that we are at the end. It's just a thing to dwell on as we move forward here. Okay, let's get to it. Let's get to the end of the Second Age. From Imladris they crossed the misty mountains by many passes and marched down the river Anduin, and so came at last to the host of Sauron on Dagorlad, the battle plain, which lies before the gate of the Black Land. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and of birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided, and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. The host of Gil-galad and Elendil had the victory, for the might of the elves was still great in those days, and the Númenóreans were strong and tall and terrible in their wrath. Against Aiglas, the spear of Gil-galad, none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and the moon, and it was named Narsil. Then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years, and suffered grievous loss by fire and the darts and bolts of the enemy, and Sauron sent many sorties against them. There in the valley of Gorgoroth, Anarion, son of Elendil, was slain, and many others. But at the last the siege was so strait that Sauron himself came forth, and he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they both were slain, and the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell. But Sauron also was thrown down, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur cut the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron and took it for his own. Then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. And that's it. That's the end of the Second Age. Sauron has been cast down, though at great and punitive loss. Aiglos, the spear of Gil-galad, means icicle. It literally means snow point, which I really like, but icicle is also a very good name. And Narsil, of course, the red and white flame forged by Telkar the dwarf during the First Age, not a Númenórean sword, an older sword, a mightier sword. Telkar also forged Angrist, the knife that Beren uses to cut the Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown, and he forges Durin's dragon helm, the dragon helm of Dorloman. I love the register with which we get this version of the story. The tone that Tolkien adopts here is historical, but it is also declamatory. It is also suffused with this sense of doom in the truest sense. Everything is playing out for the best, but there are wounds here that will not heal. And obviously, as we know, it is not a final victory. I'm fascinated by the note there in that first paragraph. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. The elves are the only ones who absolutely categorically stay on the right side of history, right? We know that there are Easterlings and Dunlandings and men of Haradrim down south and all of those men fighting on the side of Sauron. Surprising to see some dwarves here even fighting on the side of Sauron, but we get the asterisk. The kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron, which is all the dwarves that we know and care about, right? And we see the death here, the loss, as we emphasize the power and the magnitude and the formidable skill at arms of Gil-galad and Elendil. They fall. They manage to beleaguer Barad-dûr, right? They set up the siege of Barad-dûr, which must be a thing to behold. When we're thinking about how many men must be in this army, that is a thing to consider, right? They completely fence Barad-dûr and maintain that fence for 7 years. So this is, arguably, at least, a more formidable military outfit than we have seen in, the First Age back in Beleriand. Like Maethros and his buddies had nothing on this. The League of Angband was nothing compared to the League of Barad-dûr. And the story plays out as we, of course, know the story plays out. Gil-galad and Elendil are fallen. Narsil is shattered, but Isildur takes up the hilt shard of Narsil and cuts the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron and takes it for his own. More on that. Well, more on that now, I guess. I should probably try and accelerate a little bit as we're coming through here. The ruling ring passed out of the knowledge even of the wise in that age, yet it was not unmade. For Isildur would not surrender it to Elrond and Círdan, who stood by. They counselled him to cast it into the fire of Orodruin nigh at hand, in which it had been forged, so that it should perish, and the power of Sauron be forever diminished, and he would remain only as a shadow of malice in the wilderness. But Isildur refused this counsel, saying, "This I will have as wergild for my father's death and my brother's. Was it not I that dealt the enemy his death blow?" And the ring that he held seemed to him exceedingly fair to look on, and he would not suffer it to be destroyed. Taking it, therefore, he returned at first to Minas Anor, where he planted the white tree in memory of his brother Anarion. But soon he departed, and after he had given counsel to Meneldyl, his brother's son, and committed to him the realm of the south, he bore away the ring, to be an heirloom of his house, and marched north from Gondor by the way that Elendil had come. And he forsook the south kingdom, for he purposed to take up his father's realm in Eriador, far from the shadow of the Black Land. But Isildur was overwhelmed by a host of orcs that lay in wait in the misty mountains, and they descended upon him at unawares in his camp between the green wood and the great river, nigh to Loeg Ningalaron, where the Gladden fields, for he was heedless and set no guard, deeming that all his foes were overthrown. There well nigh all his people were slain, and among them were his 3 elder sons, Elendor, Aratan, and Cirion. But his wife and his youngest son, Valandil, he had left in Imladris when he went to the war. Isildur himself escaped by means of the ring, for when he wore it he was invisible to all eyes. But the orcs hunted him by scent and slot until he came to the river and plunged in. There the ring betrayed him and avenged its maker, for it slipped from his finger as he swam and was lost in the water. Then the orcs saw him as he labored in the stream, and they shot him with many arrows, and that was his end. Only 3 of his people came ever back over the mountains after long wandering, and of those one was Otar, his esquire, to whose keeping he had given the shards of the sword of Elendil. Right, in much the same way as we need to account for the existence of the ring, the chain of custody of the ring when Sauron goes off to Numenor. Here we're painstakingly presenting the chain of custody for the shards of Narsil. Wergilt here means man price, right? Something Tolkien is pulling from early Anglo-Saxon and early Germanic traditions, wherein a blood price was paid for the death of a warrior after a battle. The were here means man, the same root as werewolf, right? The were in werewolf has nothing to do with changing or transforming. It has to do with man. A werewolf is a man-wolf. That's how we understand that. If you were with me for our series on Catherine Kerr's Celtic fantasy novel Daggerspell, which was our, 4th unit, I want to say, back last year, then the concept is already familiar to you because Kerr pulls that too from real history. Meneldil, Anarian's son, is said to be the last child born on Numenor. He is 1 year old when the Great Wave carries his father's boat to the shores of Middle-earth. His name means friend or lover of the heavens, of the stars, so it's usually glossed as astronomer, which I think is just fantastic. Meneldil, Anarian's son. The Loeg Ningloron, as the text suggests, is simply the Sindarin name for the Gladden fields. Gladden, also spelled Gladon with an O at the end. It refers to it's the Old English word for a small yellow iris, a little yellow flower. So the Gladden fields are not the fields which might make one's heart glad, which is appropriate considering the death and the bloodshed that we've just seen here, but rather they are meadows here bedecked with these little yellow flowers. So the actual thing to track here, I think, is fascinating, right? Isildur has, Isildur has 200 knights with him. The opposing force is said to be at least 10 times larger. Only 3, as the narrative notes, of Isildur's troops survive. Otar here is a really interesting one because Otar is a Quenya word meaning warrior, but it is also used as a rank in the Gondorian army at this time. So it is possible that Otar is in fact not the name of Isildur's squire, but probably his rank instead. According to the disaster of, all of these details, I should say, are really coming from the disaster of the Gladden Fields in Unfinished Tales. If you have a copy of Unfinished Tales, I think that the disaster of the Gladden Fields is maybe the best piece in that entire book. I think it's a really, really special piece of writing. Tolkien delves with much more precision and thought into exactly what plays out here. According to that account, the other survivors are another knight, another warrior, with Otar and Istelmo, the squire of Elendor, Isildur's son. There is so much to be said about the history of... Well, the history is not even the right word either, right? The fate of Isildur, the nature of Isildur, Isildur the man. There's so much to explore in that space. And obviously I don't have time to really do him justice tonight. So again, ShireReckoningPod.com is where you can keep track of my other Tolkien podcast, where I take a different topic every week and delve into it in some depth. And I think that Isildur is going to be very high on that list because I find him completely fascinating, particularly returning today to Unfinished Tales and looking at the disaster of the Gladden Fields and really exploring that story because Tolkien manages to position him very differently. He reads as a much more admirable character, quite frankly, right? We're accustomed to the gloss that we get here. We're maybe accustomed to the story as it's told in the Council of Elrond. Maybe we are, primarily accustomed to the Jackson films. We kind of get this sense of Isildur as someone who just succumbs immediately to the ring, which, let's be clear, is exactly what happens, right? He takes it up, he keeps it. We know that is what happens because we're told expressly that it's fair to look upon and he would not see it destroyed, right? That is Ring 101. That is everything that we know about the power of the ring to manipulate the people near it, and particularly the bearers of the ring. That is exactly how it plays out. So Isildur takes the ring at the Battle of Dagorlad, or I guess not at the Battle of Dagorlad, but at the Siege of Barad-dûr. He claims it for his own. He then spends 2 years back in Gondor, right? He goes and plants his sapling. He sets his nephew up for success in Gondor, and then he's like, okay, everything here is done. I'm going back north. I'm going to go and claim my father's kingdom. That's the account that we get here. But in the version of the story that we get in Unfinished Tales, there's more to it than that. Isildur is actually going north. You know how we note that he takes the path that Elendil took to come south from Rivendell to confront Sauron? He's taking that same path back because he's going to Rivendell. And the reason that he's going to Rivendell, not just his wife, not just his youngest son, his sole remaining heir, but because he is going to surrender the ring. He believes that it is burdensome. He feels the painful weight of it already. He understands in that time that he doesn't have the wisdom to control the ring or to wield it or even to bear it anymore. Now, we can speculate as to whether or not he would be successful trying to give it up to Elrond. He was great, Isildur, right? A great hero of Numenor, but the ring is still very powerful. Not as powerful as it's going to be. Right? The story of the Third Age is the ring getting more powerful. Arguably, we can talk about that perhaps at another time too. But what's important here is that the version of the story that we get here is clearly not how Professor Tolkien was imagining the story playing out. I don't think that he sees Isildur as being the kind of complete failure that we see him as, particularly if we're watching the Jackson movies, right? And we get the Isildur, throw it into... Right? None of that happens here. He takes it as a blood price for his father and his brother who have been slain. He is grieving, and he kind of wants this ring. And then he almost immediately understands, oh, beans, this was a bad idea. I shouldn't have this. I should give this up to someone who can handle it properly, like Elrond. Would Elrond have accepted it? Would Elrond have borne it? We can never say for sure because it is lost now, right? That's the other part of that story. The other part of the disaster at the Gladden Fields is that he's not fleeing for himself. He is trying to get the ring away. He has this conversation with his son where his son urges him to, no, get out of here and take the ring with you. Everything is going to be, we will handle things here. There's no real expectation that they're going to handle things there, but you just need to get the ring out of here. So that is what he is doing when he plunges into the water to try and get away. It's not that he is fleeing for his own life. It's that he is deliberately trying to get the ring away, which is why he wears it in the first place. As Galadriel observes here in the chat, even Gandalf knew he wasn't strong enough to use the ring. Or, feared at least that he wasn't, right? Had the humility to understand that it would be incredibly dangerous for him to even try. Yeah. Isildur, unfortunately, lacking that wisdom, but coming to a different kind of wisdom through his experience. The upshot is this, of course, that the ring slips from his finger. He is betrayed. He is shot by orcs and dies. And we end up with the ring at the bottom of the Anduin for something like 2,400 years. 2,400 years of the One Ring just kind of hanging out in the mud and the silt at the bottom of the Great River. So, the Numenorians, let's come back to my next slide here. The Numenorians of the north immediately fragment and fade, right? It's a long, slow process. Arnor breaks into the three kingdoms of Arthedain and Cardolan and Ruthaur during the war with Angmar. We are told, quote, at length naught was left of them but a strange people wandering secretly in the wild, and other men knew not their homes nor the purpose of their journeys, right? That is the bluntest end of history here as the great kingdom of the north falters and fragments and eventually leaves us with the Dunedain of Numenor becoming the Dunedain that we recognize from the Lord of the Rings, the Rangers, right? Strider being a familiar figure. Gondor, meanwhile, endures. Gondor manages to hold it together for at least a while. Yet at the last, in the wearing of the swift years of Middle-earth, Gondor waned, and the line of Meneldil, son of Anarion, failed. For the blood of the Numenorians became much mingled with that of other men, and their power and wisdom was diminished, and their lifespan was shortened, and the watch upon Mordor slumbered. And in the days of Telemnar, the 3rd and 20th of the line of Meneldil, a plague came upon dark winds out of the east, and it smote the king and his children, and many of the people of Gondor perished. Then the forts on the borders of Mordor were deserted, and Minas Ithil was emptied of its people, and evil entered again into the Black Land secretly, and the ashes of Gorgoroth were stirred as by a cold wind, for dark shapes gathered there. It is said that these were indeed the Ulairi, whom Sauron called the Nazgul, the 9 ring wraiths that had long remained hidden, but returned now to prepare the ways for their master, for he had begun to grow again. And in the days of Eärnil, they made their first stroke, and they came by night out of Mordor over the passes of the Mountains of Shadow, and took Minas Ithil for their abode, and they made it a place of such dread that none dared to look upon it. Thereafter it was called Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and Minas Morgul was ever at war with Minas Anor in the west. So we are now around the end of the second millennium of the Third Age. That's right. That slide, we just fast-forwarded 2,000 years. It is in the year 1980 of the Third Age that the Nazgul began to move again. This is, by the way, the same year that Durin's Bane, the Balrog, is roused beneath Moria and kills Durin. So 1980, not a good year in the world of Tolkien, not a good year in our world either. Minas Ithil is captured and is transformed into Minas Morgul in 2002 of the Third Age. It always feels so weird when these dates start matching up with, real world years that I have lived through myself, right? It's hard not to think of the Nazgul capturing Minas Ithil in 2002 while listening to Papa Roach and Avril Lavigne. I don't even know. I can't now look back into the dim and misty depths of 2002 and determine exactly where pop culture was at the time. This is the moment when Minas Anor is also renamed Minas Tirith, right? The Tower of Guard. That's when this happens. It is worth remembering that the distance between Minas Anor and Minas Ithil, or Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul, is only about 50 miles. That's how close they are. They are bracketing on the east and the west the city of Osgiliath. That is their intended purpose. They are supposed to protect the city of Osgiliath from equal threats, we might suppose, from, Mordor in the east and the wildlings in the west. The people presumably of Gan Bodigan, who we see in The Lord of the Rings, of course. So we're that close together. It's a tinderbox, a pressure cooker. Use your metaphor of choice here. And then, as we're foreshadowing here, right, Gondor waned, the line of Menendel, son of Anarion, failed for the blood of Númenóreans. Again, I will asterisk that with that is some really shaky race theory, and we ought not to go there. That is not a cool place to be or a good thought to have. That's not really how people work at all, but, again, 19th century race theory leaching into Professor Tolkien's concept of the world here. But very shortly thereafter, we see the line of kings actually come to an end. Still Minas Tirith endured after the days of Eärnur, son of Eärnil, and the last king of Gondor. He it was that rode alone to the gates of Minas Morgul to meet the challenge of the Morgul Lord, and he met him in single combat. But he was betrayed by the Nazgul and taken alive into the city of torment, and no living man saw him ever again. Now Eärnur left no heir, and even the line of the but when the line of the kings failed, the stewards of the house of Mardil the Faithful ruled the city and its ever-shrinking realm. And the Rohirrim, the horsemen of the north, came and dwelt in the green land of Rohan, which before was named Calenarthon, and was part of the kingdom of Gondor. And the Rohirrim aided the lords of the city in their wars. And northward, beyond the falls of Rauros to the gates of Argonath, there were as yet other defences, powers more ancient of which men knew little, against whom the things of evil did not dare to move, until in the ripening of time their dark lord Sauron should come forth again. And until that time was come, never again in the days of Eärnil did the Nazgul dare to cross the river or to come forth from their city in shape visible to man. So we arrive at this stalemate, all for the low cost of the end of the line of kings of Gondor. Obviously, not really the end, but we think it is the end. It is the year 2043. Eärnur is the 33rd and last king of Gondor, last for a good long while, and his story is brief and tragic, right? At the end of the war of the northern kingdoms against Angmar, which, as I say, lasts centuries, Eärnur becomes aware, when he is still Prince of Gondor, when he is Captain of Gondor, he learns that the war is about to be over. The Witch King of Angmar is going to be finally victorious. So he goes north to try and help, but arrives too late to save Arthedain. He leads his forces, the remnant of the Arthedainian forces, his own forces from Gondor, the help of Círdan, the help of Glorfindel. He leads those forces east to Fornost. The Witch King challenges Eärnur to single combat, But when he charges his foe, right? When J.R.R. kicks his horse and rides into battle, his horse is spooked by the Witch King, who laughs at J.R.R.'s humiliation. It takes him a few minutes to get his horse under control, by which time Glorfindel is leading his elves into the field and the Witch King flees. He dashes away. J.R.R. wants to go after him, humiliated, right? Feeling ashamed of his horse's behavior. He wants to go after him. But Glorfindel then stalls him and gives us the prophecy, what will be so significant later, right? Glorfindel says, quote, "Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." So J.R.R. kind of sucks it up and goes back to Gondor. He's nurturing this grudge against the Witch King the whole time, only to find when he gets back that his foe is now hanging out in Minas Morgul. The Witch King challenges J.R.R. again, single combat, again. But this time he declines on the advice of his steward. 7 years later, the Witch King makes a third offer, a third challenge, and J.R.R. has had enough. He takes off his crown and he puts it in the houses of the dead. Then he takes a few trusted men and rides out and is, as the story tells us, never seen again. This is the moment, in the uncertainty of the fate of the king, that the stewards begin to rule Gondor. They will continue to do so until Faramir, the last ruling steward. This is interesting. Glad Rebecca is saying, what kind of more ancient powers might those be? And Glorfin David is suggesting Tom Bombadil. I think that Tom Bombadil is absolutely an acceptable answer. Also Lothlorien, right? I think that when we're looking north, when we're looking up past the Argonauts, when we're looking up past the falls of Rauros, when we're looking up the Anduin toward the north there, certainly we can consider the Woodland Realm. We can consider the realm of Thranduil, the Elven King, as he is referred to throughout the pages of The Hobbit, but certainly Lothlorien too, right? Galadriel is there, kind of somewhat sequestered, not an active participant in what is unfolding at this point in history, but certainly not a easy force for Sauron to overcome at this time. Remember, he is still going through this long process of rebuilding his forces and his personal power, right? His personal power is going to wax as we get closer and closer to the War of the Ring. He gets more and more powerful. That is one of the ways by which we can understand how straightforward the One Ring is when Bilbo finds it in The Hobbit, when he claims it in The Hobbit, that it doesn't, completely irrevocably corrupt him. It's because it's just not that strong at that point. It is connected to Sauron's waxing power. So at this time, I missed that last passage in the last slide there when we were talking about, the dust swirling in Mordor upon the plateau of Gorgoroth. It is a fell influence. The Nazgul are obviously still powerful, but they're maybe not as powerful as they're going to be. There's certainly no suggestion that they have their fell beasts, right? There's no suggestion that they are atop their winged mounts. It seems to be the case that they are closer to the Black Riders as we see them at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, which is another example of how the power of the ring / Sauron waxes even through the events of The Lord of the Rings itself, right? Is that the Black Riders in the Shire seem to be possessed of fairly limited power. But by the time we meet them on the battlefield at the Pelennor Fields, it's a whole different story. Let's continue. I'm realizing now that I'm an hour in, but we still have so much to cover. Let's get to the foreshadowing of the destruction of the ring, I think. Because what happens here in the story is that we pull out to frame Rivendell, right, containing the heirs of Isildur, the shards of Narsil. In the west, we're told about the Grey Havens. We've got Imladris, Rivendell, and Lothlorien endure because of the power of the three. No one knows where the fire ring Narya has gone. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's foreshadow what comes at the end of our story. Thus it was that in two domains the bliss and beauty of the elves remained still undiminished while that age endured. In Imladris and in Lothlorien, the hidden land between Celebrant and Anduin, where the trees bore flowers of gold and no orc or evil thing dared ever come. Yet many voices were heard among the elves foreboding that if Sauron should come again, then either he would find the ruling ring that was lost, or at his best his enemies would discover it and destroy it. But in either chance, the powers of the three must then fail, and all things maintained by them must fade, and so the elves should pass into the twilight, and the dominion of men begin. And so indeed it has since befallen. The 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, and the 3 have passed away, and with them the third age is ended, and the tales of the Eldar in Middle-earth draw to their close. Those were the fading years, and in them the last flowering of the elves east of the sea came to its winter. In that time the Noldor walked still in the hitherlands, mightiest and fairest of the children of the world, and their tongues were still heard by mortal ears. Many things of beauty and wonder remained on earth in that time, and many things also of evil and dread. Orcs there were, and trolls, and dragons, and fell beasts, and strange creatures old and wise in the woods whose names are forgotten. Dwarves still laboured in the hills, and wrought with patient craft works of metal and stone that none now can rival. But the dominion of man was preparing, and all things were changing, until at last the Dark Lord arose in Mirkwood again. So this is everything that we've been talking about, right? This is both the foreshadowing of the end of the story, the true end of the story, of course, not just the destruction of the ring, though we get that acknowledged here. The 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, and the 3 have passed away. But there is this inescapable sense that no matter what, no matter how history plays out from this point forward, the time of the elves, the elder days, is coming to an end. There's no world now in which a lasting victory, a lasting success is possible. Galadriel asks here a very provocative question. This is a really interesting one. Since the 3 rings never were touched by Sauron, why did they have to fade after the 1 ring was destroyed? They were not touched by Sauron, that is true, but Celebrimbor's art was touched by Sauron. It is from Sauron that he learned how to make the rings. We get this acknowledgement that when Sauron puts on the 1 ring, the ring to control and command the others, that the bearers of the 3 are aware of it. They know, they feel it right then, and they take the rings off, and they never wear them openly again until after the 1 ring is destroyed. That's why right at the end of The Lord of the Rings, it is so significant that when Frodo and Sam meet the party going west to the Grey Havens, we get the specific note that Galadriel is wearing her ring and Elrond is wearing his ring. And then when we get to the White Ship, Gandalf is wearing his ring too, which we'll talk about in the very last slide of this evening, believe it or not. And it's speculative, right? We don't know for sure that the breaking of the power of the 1 ring will remove the power of the 3, but that is suspected, it is feared, it is foreshadowed, and then that is absolutely what happens. That is what comes to pass. Is there any power left in those rings? I mean, we don't know, right? They go into the West and they are put to no further use. So you can suspect possibly that the rings still have some share of power, but because they are the product not of Sauron's direct hand, but Sauron's art, Sauron's the instruction manual that he gives to Celebrimbor, right? Because they are the product of that tainted process, they are still under the dominion of the 1 ring, though unlike the other rings, they themselves are not evil. Unlike the 9 and the 7, which are inherently evil, the 3 are not. And we can kind of, where you come down on the lesser rings, the rings that Gandalf acknowledges that they're just like essays in the craft, as he says, like small minor rings out there. Maybe they are also free of influence. Maybe they are also deprived of their power when the 1 ring is destroyed, which would be etiologically, right, from Tolkien's desire to create a myth of our modern world, you can understand why, yes, there used to be magic rings and now there aren't because the 1 big ring was destroyed, is like a pretty good narrative conceit. I think I think that gives us a lot in terms of our positioning of the myth of the Legendarium into our own deep history and kind of acknowledging the fairy tale outflow from this set of stories into the modern world. Yeah. But again, I will clarify that, Galadriel, and say that is unclear, right? Specifically, that is unclear. That is the speculation. That is what is thought, but it is unclear whether or not they are completely devoid of power, whether they were untainted in their creation and there is something about the 1 ring that gives them dominance, or they were tainted in their creation and that is why the 1 ring has dominance. Yeah. Glorfin David asking, that's the 1, the 3, the 7, and the 9. Why no 5? It's interesting, right? There aren't... I mean, I suppose were I to give like a slightly, a slightly superficial and churlish answer, I suppose, I would say that I think that maybe 5 is just not as magical. 5 is not as mythic a number, but you're absolutely right. It stands out that I've always felt the leap from 3 to 7 to be quite surprising, right? 7 clearly because we're told that there are, 7 forefathers of the dwarves. So That makes sense. But the 9 also seems to be a little bit arbitrary. It isn't clear when Tolkien, because the 9 of the Nazgul, right, matches the 9 of the Fellowship, but it isn't clear in what order those two groups of people are conceived of or set against each other. It isn't quite clear how that flows. It isn't quite clear whether we get the 9 of the Nazgul first, and then the Fellowship is like padded out to include as many people as are necessary. It's a little bit complicated, yeah. I have no better explanation than that, I'm afraid, except that, 5's maybe just not that special. 3, axiomatically, the magic number. 7, traditionally a very magic number. 9, less so, but, then you're getting into numerology. Then you're getting into, well, actually, it's 3 3s, which is doubly magic. You can take that road as far as you like. That road will just keep on running. It won't take you anywhere important. It won't take you anywhere useful, but that road will just keep on running. Let's get back to, yes. So anyway, all of this is to say that we get, no matter what, the Elder Days are passing. And this is important because we're not situating the passing of the elves at the foot of Sauron. It is not Sauron's fault directly that the Elder Days are waning, that the elves are going to depart. That is how it should be. That is the plan as it was set out, right? That is the plan that Iluvatar first conceived. That is the first theme of the great music, that the elves should be the first, and then they will wane, and then it will be the time of the followers, of the second-born children of Iluvatar. Now, obviously, there are spaces in there to talk about, well, what about the dwarves? What about the hobbits? What are we supposed to make of those populations too? For my money, dwarves and hobbits get counted as elves in terms of the passage of time through the world, right? Observably, they both retreat too. And then we get this great cutout, right? We intrude upon this with a very modern, early Fourth Age bit of framing here. And so indeed it has since befallen. The 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, the 3 have passed away, and with them the Third Age is ended, and the tales of the Eldar and Middle Earth draw to their close. But then we also foreshadow brilliantly Mirkwood. Now of old the name of that forest was Greenwood the Great, and its wide halls and aisles were the haunt of many beasts and of birds of bright song, and there was the realm of King Thranduil under the oak and the beech. But after many years, when well nigh a third of that age of the world had passed, a darkness crept slowly through the wood from the southward, and fear walked there in shadowy glades. Fell beasts came hunting, and cruel and evil creatures laid there their snares. Then the name of the forest was changed to Mirkwood. To Mirkwood it was called, for the nightshade lay deep there, and few dared to pass through, save only in the north, where Thranduil's people still held the evil at bay. Whence it came few could tell, and it was long ere even the wise could discover it. It was the shadow of Sauron, and the sign of his return. For coming out of the wastes of the east, he took up his abode in the south of that forest, and slowly he grew and took shape there again. In a dark hill he made his dwelling, and wrought there his sorcery, and all folk feared the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, and yet they knew not at first how great was their peril. Glad Rebecca observing in the chat. I think somewhere it's explained that hobbits mix with men. Yes, that is the genetic legacy of the hobbits, I suppose, is that they, again, right, tough race theory here, but they intermarry with the men of the north. As the men become less, so the hobbits become more. They kind of meet in the middle in the form of modern man, and that is what happens. But the hobbit culture does pass away, right? You'll remember the beat that we get at the beginning of the Hobbit, appropriately enough, when the narrator breaks into his own story to tell us about the nature of hobbits and how shy they are around the big people, as they call us. So having made it through narratively, glad Rebecca also saying Dol Guldur is a great name. It is one of my absolute favorites. It is so punchy. Yes, all the right evil sounding phonemes right there. Just so strong. Having made it all the way through the first 2 millennia of the Third Age, then we are now rewinding all the way back to the year 1050 of the Third Age. Thranduil has been living in the Greenwood, now become the Mirkwood, since around 750 of the Second Age, or what is that, 3,500 years. His father, Orifer, who I mentioned earlier, is a Sindar elf who lived in Menegroth under the rule of King Thingol through the First Age, but after the ruin of Doriath and the War of Wrath, Orifer declines the invitation of the Valar to go into the west and instead heads east and takes his son with him. I think we maybe had I maybe had a moment of confusion very early in the seminar series. I don't now remember exactly when it happened, but I had always thought, I suppose, that the elves of Mirkwood were primarily the Lyquendi, the green elves of Assyrian. And though the Sylvan elves, the wood elves here, are a neighboring branch of the Teleri, most of the Sylvan elves who live in the woodland realm never made it to Beleriand. They just set up camp right here near the Anduin right from the beginning. They are one of the branches of the Teleri that just did not continue the trip. I mentioned this primarily because no matter how many times you read these books, there's still more to learn. It's pretty fantastic. So the elves of Lothlorien and the elves of the Woodland Realm are primarily Sylvan, so they are the elves who did not go further west, and Lyquendi, the green elves who did go west and have now come back. Both populations absorb some Sindarin elves from Beleriand, and by this point in history, some of the Avari, some of the elves who didn't accept the invitation to go west at all, right? The wild elves who have been living out here this whole time. So the primary identities at this point in history of both the Woodland Realm and the elves of Lothlorien are Sylvan. They are the Galathrim, as they are called in Lothlorien, right? And I really love how we lay this out, that it is... Galadriel Becky says, thank you, Galadriel Becky. Yes, it was when I mentioned that I thought Legolas was from the Lyquendi. There you go. Thank you so much. Yes. Not pure Lyquendi, for sure, but yeah, of the the line of kings is Sindarin, yes. There's no mention of a large retinue coming here. It's unclear whether it is just Oropher and Thranduil, who is... well, I was going to say young at that point, but not young, because still elves, right? And yes, so the line of Legolas does come through his Sindarin parentage, but the body of the population here, Sylvan and Lyquendi. Yes, good lord. It's tough keeping all of this stuff straight, isn't it? So here we get the first kind of... it's one of the first times in the Legendarium that Tolkien returns to an initial idea and repositions it. The role of the necromancer, as he is known through the pages of The Hobbit in Dol Guldur, is simply a distraction mechanism for Gandalf. It's a means of getting Gandalf out of the story, because if Gandalf is in the story, it's a story about Gandalf, right? If Gandalf is there, he's going to be able to handle anything that comes their way, particularly at that point in the development of the story, at that point in the literal narrative of The Hobbit, as we are continuing this episodic adventure east, right? As we're just crossing these thresholds further and further into the wild, Gandalf can kind of handle anything that's thrown at him. So we introduce the idea of Dol Guldur, we introduce the idea of the necromancer as a means of shooing him out of the plot. And then when he returns, we're in the higher order narrative of the Battle of the Five Armies, right? Oh my God, I just slipped up. I added the extra the. Jackson has incepted me. It has happened. I am actually embarrassed right now. The Battle of Five Armies. No extra extraneous the necessary. By the time we get to the Battle of Five Armies, the tone of the book has shifted so much that Gandalf is now not the skeleton key solution to every trouble that we face. So he fits back in more organically at that point. So the conception of Dol Guldur is simply a distraction for Gandalf at this point. But then when Tolkien comes into The Lord of the Rings and he's reconsidering the role of the ring and he's reconsidering the role of Gollum, Dol Guldur is one of those things that is tickling his brain. And this is where we reposition it in the narrative as the first bastion of the re-emergent Sauron, right? That's how we get there. Let's see how this plays out with the... because before we even get to that, we have to cut all the way out to the introduction of the Istari. That's the next thing. Because before we can deal with before we can deal with Dol Guldur, we have to introduce our heroes. Even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at this time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the lords of the west to contest the power of Sauron if he should rise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. In the likeness of men they appeared, old but vigorous, and they changed little with the years and aged but slowly, though great cares lay on them, great wisdom they had, and many powers of mind and hand. Long they journeyed far and wide among elves and men, and held converse also with beasts and with birds, and the peoples of Middle-earth gave to them many names, for their true names they did not reveal. Chief among them were those whom the elves called Mithrandir and Curanir, but men in the north named Gandalf and Saruman. Of these, Curanir was the eldest and came first, and after him came Mithrandir and Radagast, and others of the Astari who went into the east of Middle-earth and do not come into these tales. Radagast was a friend of all beasts and birds, but Curanir went most among men, and he was subtle in speech and skilled in all the devices of smithcraft. Mithrandir was closest in council with Elrond and the elves. He wandered far in the north and west, and made never in any land any lasting abode. But Curanir journeyed into the east, and when he returned, he dwelt at Orthanc in the ring of Isengard, which the Númenóreans made in the days of their power. So, we can gloss the names. I guess the names are pretty important. Gandalf is an actual Norse name. It is an actual Norse word. These are two spots here where Tolkien kind of breaks his own rules about just importing names from other languages, right? We've seen a little bit of that. It does happen, but it's relatively unusual. But here we get two examples, or at least potentially two examples of names just being pulled in. The most obvious is Gandalf, just a Norse name that means an elf with a magic staff is basically what it means there. Mithrandir, his Sindarin name, as we get, which is used in Gondor most actively, means grey pilgrim or grey wanderer. Myth grey, right? Mithril also we see, and Randir, pilgrim or wanderer, right? The grey wanderer. Saruman is Saruman directly translates as man of skill, but the skill there means cunning or devices, or it has a connotation of like mechanical skill. And that's matched by Curanir, right? Man of skill, man of craft, right? We've seen the Kuru prefix before, right? We're familiar with that. And then the name Radagast doesn't really get glossed by Tolkien. He doesn't offer a very clear translation of what it means, but a couple of really excellent Tolkien scholars have kind of, again, identified it in other unusual sources. Mark Fisher, the excellent Mark Fisher, suggests that it is the name Rudugast, which is simply, in Old English, the red-brown spirit, right? Which is pretty appropriate, right? Radagast the brown, the red-brown spirit, makes a certain amount of sense. And John D. Ratliff, who I've been relying on so much for the Shire Reckoning series, where I'm covering the Hobbit, John Ratliff wrote the history of the Hobbit and did a fantastic job of it. He suggests that Radagast might mean another Old English name, combining Rad and Gast, meaning spirit of the road, which is interesting. I'm a little less moved by that. I'm a little less poetically moved by that. I do kind of find the red-brown spirit that Mark Fisher suggests to be pretty appropriate, but yes. So this is perhaps to readers of The Lord of the Rings, particularly contemporary readers, as the Silmarillion is published shortly after the death of Professor Tolkien, when The Lord of the Rings, because it takes a little while for The Lord of the Rings to really reach its greatest and most popular height, it is still very much in the zeitgeist by the time that Professor Tolkien passes and the Silmarillion is compiled and published. And this must have been a revelation to contemporary readers. I think that, well, I don't know. I hesitate to say that. I think that readers of The Lord of the Rings kind of have a concept now of Gandalf and the other wizards being this kind of creature. But this is a real move to reposition them, right? Because there's no sense, as you're reading The Hobbit, as you're reading the development of The Hobbit in particular, there's no sense that Gandalf is anything other than a man. There's no sense that he's anything other than the wizard is his occupation, right? Rather than his essential nature. And I think that persists through the entirety of The Hobbit, and it isn't until we get to this notion. There is another piece in Unfinished Tales. I mentioned Unfinished Tales earlier. There's another piece called The Astari in Unfinished Tales, which gives even more insight into what is happening here. I'm looking very nervously at the clock now. We need to push on. Now that we have this sense, right? We have the sense of Radagast going out and befriending the beasts and the birds, right? Radagast is aligned with Yavanna as Gandalf studied with Nienna, and thus learned pity and wisdom and the power of grief. So Radagast studied with and was associated with Yavanna, which is why his connection to the natural world is so powerful. Galadriel Becky saying, I always thought wizards were as different from men as elves. That was your first reading coming into it. That's very perceptive. That's very astute. I don't know that I had... God, I mean, it's been so long and I've revisited these now so many times. I don't know that I can really remember my first impressions of really any part of the Lord of the Rings. It's all become overwritten. You know, there is a many-scored palimpsest of my original memory of reading The Lord of the Rings, but it has been, you know, there are so many additions and scratches and highlighter marks and diagrams and maps and pasted in URLs and all the other stuff that comes along in the years that pass, you know. But I think that's very perceptive of you, Galadriel Becky, for sure. Let's get to Mithrandir here then, counseling the attack on Dol Guldur. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and he it was that doubted the darkness in Mirkwood, for though many deemed that it was wrought by the ring-wraiths, he feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning. And he went to Dol Guldur, and the sorcerer fled from him, and there was a watchful peace for a long while. But at length the shadow returned, and its power increased, and in that time was first made the Council of the Wise that is called the White Council. And therein were Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir and Curanir. And Curanir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged him that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place nor be subject to any summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the rings of power, their making, and their history. Now the shadow grew ever greater, and the hearts of Elrond and Mithrandir darkened. Therefore, on a time, Mithrandir at great peril went again to Dol Guldur in the pits of the sorcerer, and he discovered the truth of his fears and escaped. And returning to Elrond, he said, True, alas, is our guess. This is not one of the Olyri, as many have long supposed. It is Sauron himself who has taken shape again and now grows apace, and he is gathering again all the rings to his hand, and he seeks ever for news of the one and of the heirs of Isildur if they live still on earth. And Elrond answered, In the hour that Isildur took the ring and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought, that Sauron should return. Great foreboding as we move forward. We're foreshadowing hard here Saruman the White's fall. We do it in the very, I didn't even call it out on the previous slide, right? But as soon as we are told that he is subtle and skilled, those are red flags. Those are immediately like warning signs. Anyone who is subtle, as we've discussed through this entire series, if you are subtle, then you are problematic. You are probably going to have to walk very carefully to make sure that you stay on the light side of things. But here we're also combining that with his study into the rings of power. He is the one that has studied the devices of Sauron of old, which I take to mean his strategies and plans and purposes rather than actual physical devices. But hey, who knows? It could also mean little mechanical contraptions. Saruman is that kind of guy, after all. So we're establishing the relationship here between the White Council and also accelerating our need. And as Elrond said, in the hour that Isildur took the ring and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought that Sauron should return. And we might pause right there to question outright how it is that Elrond knows so much, how it is that Elrond is so confident that destroying the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom specifically would remove the threat of Sauron effectively, right? That is something about the continued existence of the ring that is allowing Sauron to reform himself, to return here. It's an interesting bit of supposition on his part, for sure. Let's get to Dol Guldur. We've still got to do the entire Lord of the Rings here. This is amazing. Here we are. It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7 he has recovered 3. We must strike. To this Curanir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time he aided the council, and they put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur, and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood for a brief while was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, For the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all his movements, and the Olayri, his 9 servants, had gone before him to make ready for his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned, and ere the wise could prevent him, he re-entered his kingdom in Mordor, and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. And in that year the White Council met for the last time, and Curanir withdrew to Isengard, and took counsel with none save himself. And there we go. That's the full house. Curanir, Saruman the White, he has all the red flags. Now, he's managed to assemble the last one, taking no counsel, but his own. Yep, perfect. Isolation, perfect. There we go. He's really continuing the legacy of people who are just too confident about their own intelligence and their superiority to others around him. So all of this is just repositioning the story of the Necromancer of Dol Guldur within the span of the Lord of the Rings, right? We're told even there that we're told within the pages of the Lord of the Rings that he feigns to flee. This is the story as it unfolds. The White Council has moved to action. Saruman has moved to action now for 2 reasons. Because the argument has become too compelling and it starts to become suspicious if he doesn't go along with it, but mostly because Dol Guldur is too close to the Gladden Fields, and he already suspects, he already knows at this point that Sauron has people out dredging the river, has orcs out dredging the river, dredging the Anduin along the Gladden Fields. He wants to search that space. He wants to find the One Ring for himself. He has already become convinced that is where it was lost and that is where it remains. So he works with the White Council, as we're told here, for the last time. They drive Sauron out, but he feigns to flee. He retreats, as he has already planned to retreat, to Mordor, begins rebuilding Barad-dûr, and begins building his strength once more for the final battle, right? For the coming War of the Ring. Let's get immediately to that. We've got, this is it. This is the depth of it now. I've got 3 slides left to go, and this is going to cover the entirety of the Lord of the Rings. So let's get to it. Orcs were mustering, and far to the east and the south the wild peoples were arming. Then in the midst of gathering fear, the rumor of war, the foreboding of Elrond was proved true, and the One Ring was indeed found again, by a chance more strange than even Mithrandir had foreseen, and it was hidden from Curanir and from Sauron. For it had been taken from Anduin long ere they sought for it, being found by one of the small fisher folk that dwelt by the river, ere the kings failed in Gondor. And by its finder it was brought beyond search into dark hiding under the roots of the mountains. There it dwelt, until even in the year of the assault upon Dol Guldur it was found again by a wayfarer fleeing into the depths of the earth from the pursuit of the orcs, and passed into a far distant country, even to the land of the Perianath, the little people, the halflings, who dwelt in the west of Eriador. And ere that day they had been held of small account by elves and by men, and neither Sauron nor any of the wise, save Mithrandir, had in all their counsels given thought to them. Now, by fortune and his vigilance, Mithrandir first learned of the ring ere Sauron had news of it. Yet he was dismayed and in doubt. For too great was the evil power of this thing for any of the wise to wield, unless, like Curanir, he wished himself to become a tyrant and a dark lord in his turn. But neither could it be concealed from Sauron forever, nor could it be unmade by the craft of the elves. Therefore, with the help of the Dunedain of the north, Mithrandir set a watch upon the land of the Perianath and bided his time. But Sauron had many ears, and soon he heard rumour of the One Ring, which above all things he desired, and he set forth the Nazgul to take it. Then war was kindled, and in battle with Sauron the Third Age ended even as it had begun. And as an encapsulation of the story of The Hobbit and the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, this is a pretty great one, I think. We've got the marshalling of power, right? Things are growing darker day by day by day, but there's this slim chance, this slim hope, that this remarkable happenstance, right? A chance more strange than even Mithrandir had foreseen, hidden from Curanir, hidden from Saruman, hidden from Sauron, that the ring is found by one of the small fisher folk who lived in the vales of the Anduin prior to the fall of Gondolin. This is, of course, the story of Deagol and Smeagol. This is the story of the finding of the ring and the taking of the ring. Note here that Gollum is completely absent from this narrative, right? He can be inferred, but we're not talking about Gollum. We are talking about the ring itself. The ring itself is making these choices. The ring itself is moving, right? By its finder, it was brought beyond search into dark hiding under the roots of the mountain. There it dwelt, until even in the year of the assault upon Dol Guldur, it was found again by a wayfarer fleeing into the depths of the earth. One Bilbo Baggins. We see here, too, this incidental detail of the world building, which I always find so fascinating to consider from the perspective of the Hobbits. Because I've been talking about The Hobbit over on Shire Reckoning, I've been thinking a lot about the way that book positions itself in terms of the history of the Shire, which is to say that it positions itself almost inconsequentially in terms of the history of the Shire. I mentioned in a recent episode that the passage of time, that history itself touches the Shire very lightly. There is a sense within the Shire that this is a status quo, that this is just how things are, that there is just peace here. And that isn't true. Like, the Shire is protected. By the time we get to Frodo, by the time we pass the 17 years between Bilbo leaving and Frodo leaving, right? By the time that Frodo is 50 and actually takes off on his journey, the Shire has been fenced by the Dunedain for a long time, ever since Bilbo returns with the ring, to keep it safe, to keep this land protected, to keep it under watchful guard. And there is this sense throughout our time in the Shire that it is both permanent and vanishingly transitory, right? That it is the way that it has always been and will always be, because there is no history and there is no future, and it is only ever this slim moment of nowness, this slim moment of being, this slim moment of breakfast and smoking your pipe out of doors. And there's a freedom that comes with that, but combining that with this idea that Gandalf has set the Dunedain around the Shire to keep an eye on the hobbits, I think I always find that just fascinating, and such a rich and thoughtful and careful and detailed part of the story, that it isn't sufficient to rely on luck and good fortune, right? Throughout this story, we're seeing these moments of luck, but we're also seeing these moments of study. It is chance and watchfulness that gets Gandalf in the position that he needs to be in. It is the magic of the Shire and the watchful eyes of the Dunedain that protect the Shire for as long as they do, right? That get us all the way through to Frodo beginning his journey. The Pedianath here, as is glossed just in the text, it means halfling in both Sindarin and Quenya. They just are close enough at that point to sorry. And we get to, let me call this slide back up just so you can see it here. Ere that day they had been held of small account by elves and by men, and neither Sauron nor any of the wise save Mithrandir had in all their councils given thought to them, which is really great, right? Because that includes Elrond, that includes Círdan the Shipwright. The elves are passing through the Shire all the time, going back and forth from Imladris to the White Towers, all the way perhaps even to the Grey Havens. They're passing through the Shire all the time and give no thought to them. And it is Gandalf's special acuity. It is his love of the weak. That's where we get the title for this week's session. It is his love of the small and the powerless, his belief in the power of the powerless, his belief in the goodness of the weak, that puts him in exactly the position that he needs to be in. Gandalf is... Oh, you know what? We'll come back to this. We will close in on Gandalf and the success of the Astari in our final slide. But before we get to that, hey, do y'all want to do the whole of the Lord of the Rings in one slide? Let's do that, right? But those who saw the things that were done in that time, deeds of valor and wonder, have elsewhere told the tale of the War of the Ring and how it ended both in victory unlooked for and in sorrow long foreseen. Here let it be said that in those days the heir of Isildur arose in the north, and he took the shards of the sword of Elendil, and in Imladris they were reforged, and he went then to war, a great captain of men. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the 39th heir in the right line from Isildur, and yet more like to Elendil than any before him. Battle there was in Rohan, and Coronir the traitor was thrown down, and Isengard broken, and before the city of Gondor a great field was fought, and the Lord of Morgul, captain of Sauron, there passed into darkness, and the heir of Isildur led the host of the west to the black gates of Mordor. In that last battle were Mithrandir and the sons of Elrond, and the king of Rohan, and lords of Gondor, and the heir of Isildur with the Dunedain of the north. There at the last they looked upon death and defeat, and all their valor was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof that which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For as many songs have since sung, it was the Perianath, the little people, dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. For Frodo the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took on himself the burden, and alone with his servant he passed through peril and darkness, and came at last in Sauron's despite even to Mount Doom. and there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade, and its evil consumed. You know, asterisk, 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 Gollum was also there. Gollum makes no appearance, no impression on this version of the story at all, which I find really quite fascinating. And of course, let us take a moment to consider the positioning of Sam. Should Sam be better represented in this account? For Frodo the Halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took on himself the burden, and alone with his servant, he passed through peril and darkness. Alone with his servant. And I think that Sam would actually like that. I think that Sam, who is, as we all are, in need of some kind of therapy, I think that Sam would appreciate that this is Frodo's story, that this is the story of Master Frodo. I think that he would rather be on the sidelines of this tale than he would be given a starring role, right? So we just dispense with it so quickly, but we also, in that quick dispensation, we really manage to architect the power and the beauty of the Lord of the Rings here. We manage to oppose the heights of power and of drama and of excellence and of majesty, of true, actual majesty, with this line that Gandalf has been walking the whole time, with the hands of the weak, right? Help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. That is the thesis of the Lord of the Rings. It is one of the theses of the Lord of the Rings, but it is perhaps the most important one. That power corrupts, and that in the end, humility is what saves us. Humility and connection and service, acts of stewardship, acts of gardening. That is what gets us through the dark nights. That is where we open the door to the possibility of intercessory grace, where we open the door to the possibility of eucatastrophe, when we trust in the nature of the world to assist us, to aid us, to meet us where we are as we meet it where it is. It is enormously poetic. It is enormously moving. Frankly, moving, to have it condensed, right? To have it purified to this degree, to have it distilled down, so you get like the raw magic here. You're just getting the uncut stuff here from Professor Tolkien. That the great and the good are arrayed before Moran, and they go to the Black Gate of Mordor, and they are screwed. Because even in all of their power, we get that whole list: Mithrandir and the sons of Elrond and the king of Rohan and the lords of Gondor and the heir of Isildur and the Dunedain of the north, and it's nothing. It's not enough. You can marshal all the power you want, but you're not going to succeed against a greater foe. That it takes the help, the hands of the weak. Yeah, Glorfin David's calling out. We could have mentioned in my name that Sam could at least have got a name. Yes, I agree. And Glatterbeck is saying they also didn't mention most of the others, like Eowyn. They sure don't, do they? The Lord of Morgul, Captain of Sauron, there passed into darkness. Passive voice, y'all. Passive voice. The heir of Isildur led the host of the West to the Black Gates of Mordor. That's it. That's the magic. And I think there's an open question, right? When you're reading the Silmarillion, I've described this chapter now in 2 successive episodes of this podcast. I've described this chapter as being your reward for making it through the rest of the Silmarillion, particularly making it through the Akalabaeth, right? And I do think that is true, but I'm also being just a little facetious. I don't know quite what the value is of including this sketch of the Lord of the Rings. I don't think that anyone is coming to the Silmarillion without understanding the Lord of the Rings. And certainly if you don't know the Lord of the Rings, you're not getting it from this. This is a great little supercut, right? This is the little anime music video version of the Lord of the Rings. And it's powerful for that, but it's powerful in its referential sense, right? It's indexing the Lord of the Rings in a way that's very accessible to those of us who know that book so well. To those of us who already have those feelings, it's a great way of kind of hitting that button and giving you that little dopamine rush of, yeah, I remember when all of this happened. It was the greatest book I've ever read. But I don't know why it is included necessarily in this tone, in this spot in the book, except as a reward for the reader. And I think I'm going to leave this as just an open question, because one of the things that we are now not going to have time to do here at 10:35 with a big slide left to go, one of the things that we're not now going to have time to do is to really reflect on the experience of reading the Silmarillion and how we are changed in our approach to Tolkien's Legendarium as a whole. I've read the Silmarillion before. I've read the Silmarillion quite carefully before. I have never read the Silmarillion this carefully. I have never gone to the trouble of really, really trying to figure out all the various strands of elvendom that we have. I've never really necessarily gone to the trouble of trying to figure out all of the geography of Beleriand and its realms. I've never really tried to internalize the names of the sons of Feanor and really kind of get to grips with all that there is there. And I think that it's tempting as we reach the end of this book and we find ourselves back on familiar territory to do exactly that, to reflect and to consider not the version of the Lord of the Rings that's right there on the page in front of us, because as I say, it is narratively effective. It is emotionally effective. It is a great encapsulation that really highlights what matters about that book. But the purpose, I'm attributing a purpose, but to me, by inference, the purpose of its inclusion here is not just to evoke the happy memories of reading The Lord of the Rings. It's not just to celebrate again with Frodo and Sam. It's not just to celebrate again with Aragorn and Arwen. It's to see these events in a way that we could not in the pages of The Lord of the Rings itself, as the culmination of history, the not inevitable product, right? But the inarguable product of all that has come before. It positions this story as the end of the Elder Days in a way that certainly the book itself is devastatingly effective, right? You can't read the Grey Havens and not infer all of that weight and majesty and profundity of the time of the elves passing, the magic leaving the world, like literally leaving the world. You can get all of that from The Lord of the Rings, but not, I think, in this scale, not to this extent. I want to pick up here as we're it's a commercial to sell another copy of the Lord of the Rings book. Yeah, I mean, sure. If you don't want to immediately jump back into the Lord of the Rings when you're done with the Silmarillion, then you and I are very different people. Yes, and glad Rebecca's saying, I think it's more of a way to show how all the Legendarium is connected into one big history for Tolkien's sake. I think that is it. It is the positioning of the Lord of the Rings as not even the biggest story, right? The last story. The last story, yes, and end weight carries some significance with it. It has a certain primacy to it because it is the end of the story, and endings are inescapably emotionally important for us, for human beings, for people who invest their sense of belief and their desire to believe into these fictions. The ends are always important. But through the Silmarillion, I think that we can see the true meaning and the great themes of Tolkien's work, which are present in The Lord of the Rings, present to some extent in The Hobbit too. We can see them more clearly and more powerfully, and thus get that juice again from The Lord of the Rings when it's presented to us in the span of a single page. I absolutely have to get to our last slide here because we still have a couple things to talk about before we're done tonight. This is the end of the Silmarillion. Now, all these things were achieved for the most part by the counsel and vigilance of Mithrandir. And in the last few days he was revealed as a lord of great reverence, and clad in white he rode into battle. But not until the time came for him to depart was it known that he had long guarded the red ring of fire. At the first that ring had been entrusted to Círdan, lord of the Havens, but he had surrendered it to Mithrandir, for he knew whence he came, and whither at last he would return. Take now this ring, he said, for thy labours and thy cares will be heavy, but in all it will support thee and defend thee from weariness, for this is the ring of fire. And herewith, maybe, thou shalt rekindle hearts to the valour of the old in a world that grows chill. But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores, guarding the havens until the last ship sails. Then I shall await thee. White was that ship, and long was it a building, and long it awaited the end of which Círdan had spoken. But when all these things were done, and the heir of Isildur had taken up the lordship of man, and the dominion of the west was passed to him, then it was made plain that the power of the three rings also was ended, and to the firstborn the world grew old and grey. In that time the last of the Noldor set sail from the havens and left Middle-earth forever. And latest of all, the keepers of the three rings rode to the sea, and Master Elrond took there the ship that Círdan had made ready. In the twilight of autumn it sailed out of Mithlond, until the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more. And borne upon the high airs above the mists of the world, it passed into the ancient west, and an end was come for the Eldar of story and of song. Sailing, sailing, sailing. The positioning here of Gandalf as, if not the hero of the story, at least the most significant figure in the story, I think is enormously intentional, because in Gandalf we are reconciling ourselves to both this notion of great power and great humility. And I think that one of the things that we were challenged by here right at the end of the story, I mentioned this fairly recently because I produced an episode of my old podcast, There and Back Again, where I did finish up the last couple of chapters of The Lord of the Rings and looked in some depth at the movement of the Grey Havens chapter. And one of the things that really stood out to me there was the absence of Radagast the Brown. And I said at the time that it confirmed to me the implication. I think it is strongly implied at the Council of Elrond when we are told that the scouts have gone to Rosgobel and no trace of Radagast can be found, that in fact Radagast has died, that otherwise he would be here, right? Otherwise he would also be leaving with all the other magic of Middle-earth and sailing into the West. And that encouraged me to kind of think some more about the role of Radagast and to speculate a little about how we are supposed to view him, how we are supposed to think about the wizards in general, the Astari in general, right? Because the five come into Middle-earth and Saruman obviously fails, right? Obviously is corrupted. The blue wizards are said to have failed too. And perhaps even Radagast also failed, right? There's a... in that essay that I mentioned earlier, the Astari in the Unfinished Tales, we get a little snatch of song that Tolkien gives us. I'll quote this here. "Wilt thou learn the lore that was long secret of the five that came from a far country? Only one returned, others never again." Strongly suggesting that Radagast did in fact die, or at least that he will not return, right? There is perhaps this idea, this hope that he has become absorbed by Middle-earth, right? That he is just out there in the world, that he is just wandering until such time as I don't know, maybe he dies, or maybe he is immortal, and maybe he will just make it to the very end of the world. I wanted to call this out, though. The longer quote here from that same passage from the Astari in the Unfinished Tales. "Indeed," writes Tolkien, "indeed, of all the Astari, only one remained faithful, and he was the last comer. For Radagast the Fourth became enamored of the many beasts and birds that dwelt in Middle-earth, and forsook elves and men, and spent his days among wild creatures." Later in life, Tolkien softened his response to Radagast, what he initially conceived as a failure, right? That five Astari are sent and one of them succeeds. Only Gandalf manages to do what he was actually set out to do, which is a very significant thing when we consider that the Astari are incredibly powerful beings, right? They are themselves individually on the level of Sauron. They are of the same order of beings as Sauron, as Durin's Bane the Balrog, right? They are of the Maiar. We know this for sure from our introduction to Gandalf himself, right? His fleeting reference all the way back in the Valaquenta. We know for sure that is their nature. And they are clearly constrained from exercising power within the realm of Middle-earth for reasons which exceed our possibility of discussion here tonight. I'm kind of hedging around this, and I'm kind of still working through exactly what it is that I feel about the positioning of Gandalf as the central figure of this latter era of the Legendarium. And certainly the focal attention that he is given as the hero of the Lord of the Rings, right? Not quite the right way of putting that, but to praise his counsel and his vigilance, to praise his faith in the small people, in the hands of the weak, to praise his wisdom here, I think. And obviously all of this stemming from his allegiance to Nienna, his association with Nienna, his understanding of pity and of wisdom. And I think that it's an enormously powerful thing to position. Here's what I'm wrestling with. I may not, it turns out. Sometimes you can just start talking about a thing and maybe you'll get to the point that you're trying to make. You'll discover it as you go in a very Tolkienian fashion, right? I'm starting to feel like that's not going to happen. So here's what I'm going to do is lay out the conundrum in which I find myself, the irresolvable kind of conflict that I'm feeling right now, which is simply this, that the success of the War of the Ring and the final passing of the days of magic, the Elder Days in Middle-earth, is directly attributed by the text itself to the deeds of Frodo and his servant, alone with his servant, right? Just Frodo by himself accomplishing this thing. But more generally, to the weak. The powerful fall. The powerful are corrupted. The powerful succumb and the weak do not. When the wise falter, the weak can still offer help. And I'm thinking about how we understand that at this terminal moment here in the story, in terms of our repositioning of Gandalf as a mentor figure, as a wise figure, as a focal point for the narrative strand. And I'm just not sure that I have anything there. I'm just not sure that I can really, it feels like there is traction happening. It feels as though I'm being led toward an in-universe diegetic explanation of the purpose of this text, right? The purpose of this text and its positioning of Mithrandir as a focal point, I find very interesting, right? The sidelining of certain elements we could read as a product of Tolkien's initial attempt to maintain the kind of documentary integrity of all of the many texts within the Silmarillion. But I also stuck with the realization, with the understanding that this part of the story, more than any other, this part of the book, excuse me, more than any other, was rewritten by Christopher Tolkien, by Guy Gavriel Kay, right? This is, in some sense, to some degree, less the professor's raw, unadulterated work than other parts of the Silmarillion, and almost none of the Silmarillion is raw and unadulterated. They're all edited and compiled, and I'll say again, for the record, that I think that what Christopher Tolkien accomplished throughout his literary career, his academic career, I think is basically peerless. I think it's a phenomenal body of work, and he has left us in a position whereby we can understand the works of Professor Tolkien with so much more certainty and certainty is maybe exactly the wrong word to use there, but we just have so much more material. We have so much more opportunity for analysis, for exploration, for discovery within those texts, thanks to the work of Christopher Tolkien. And ultimately, for all that I love what we get here, for all that I love the encapsulation of the history of all of Arda, right? For all that I love this revisit to the end of The Lord of the Rings and the passing of the magic into the West. And for all that I do think that it is, on the level of just prose on the page, enormously powerful and compelling, I'm still left with something uncertain right here at the end of the story. And I'm not sure that that's accidental. I'm not sure that it's intentional, right? I'm not sure that it was intended that I come away from this text feeling a little ambivalent about the purpose of the text itself. But ultimately, I come away with an enormous affection. I come away, well, with a sense of satisfaction, honestly. I do not remember the first time that I read The Lord of the Rings, Gladderbecki, but I do certainly remember the first time that I read the Silmarillion, and I did not absorb a lot of it. I did not absorb all of it by any means, and I do remember coming to the story of the Rings of Power in the Third Age like it was an oasis in the desert, like it was this, having, as I said before, just I don't emotionally engage with the Akalabaeth the way that I wish that I did. But coming through that and getting to this, getting to stuff that I know, getting to stuff that is familiar, getting to stuff that I love already, really did feel like a reward, So many people try and read the Silmarillion. So many people who love The Hobbit, who love The Lord of the Rings, pick it up as the other thing that Tolkien wrote, again, with asterisks attended, right? But so many people don't make it through. So many people bounce out for very good and reasonable reasons. But having come through it, I think that I am forever enriched by this experience, if no other, right? Certainly reading the Silmarillion previously has been an enormously rewarding endeavor for me, but reading it this carefully and discussing it with all of you, composing these slides and putting together all of this extra material, writing, God, I have no idea, tens and tens and tens of thousands of words of notes. This has been enormously rewarding for me. And I guess here at the end of all things, I'm just very grateful that you guys came on this journey with me. And with that, let us say farewell to the Silmarillion. You did it. Good job. Next week, we are going to begin our, I'm going to say, 11th unit here on Stars and Swords. This has been, for those of you who have joined me over the course of the Silmarillion, this has been an extremely long unit. I do not plan on having another one this long for a good long time. I'm going to switch my attention, as I say, to Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility for the month of August into September. I think we're going to try and do 6 weeks. The first session next week is going to be on the first 10 chapters of Volume 1 of Sense and Sensibility. I hope that you'll be able to join me for that. As I've said before, it is just a brilliant book, just a really, really good book, and I cannot wait to To change gears a little bit, if you're here for the Tolkien, then by all means join me over on Shire Reckoning. 2 episodes every week, Sunday and Tuesday. We are moving into the 3rd chapter of The Hobbit in next week's live show, next Tuesday, which will be, what is it now, the 31st? I do this at the end of every session, and for some reason, when I'm working with my broadcast software up, my very simple calendar will not work, and that's just dumb. I don't know why it works like that. Again, patreon.com/nextword. But seriously though, patreon.com/nextword, because one of the things that we will be doing as we move into Sense and Sensibility is going to be bringing back, resurrecting from the dead, the Stars and Swords bonus episode. I haven't done a bonus episode since February because I have been so busy putting together these extra length podcast sessions. So we're going to be certainly looking at the 1995 adaptation of Sense and Sensibility. If the new one arrives, I guess when the new one arrives, we're going to look at that too. If there are any other notable adaptations, we'll probably look at those. After Sense and Sensibility, we're probably going to look at something in modern horror. I owe everyone a discussion of the Murderbot Diaries. I really want to talk about those. Maybe we'll just do those after. I don't know how many weeks it would take to fit them all in, or if there's a representative sample, maybe we can fit those in after Austin is over. But all of that lies in the future. As I say, please visit and support patreon.com/nextword and help me continue to do all of this, to continue to podcast about Tolkien and now other books too. Tolkien has been occupying the largest part of my brain for the last 6 months, and it's going to be really nice to think about some other things, but also really nice to continue thinking about Tolkien too. Galadriel, Becky, Glorfin, David in particular, thank you so much for being with me through this entire thing. It's been an absolute blast having you here in the chat. Thank you to everyone else who is watching live. Thank you to everyone who is listening after the fact. It has been and continues to be an absolute pleasure. I will talk to you all again next week with new album art and probably a new name for our little meeting group here, right? No, Silmarillion airs no longer. Now we need something for Austin and Sense and Sensibility. Start those, pun engines working. I'm sure we'll come up with something together. All right, that's going to do it for tonight. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you all again